Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a real-life horror story that took place on Halloween night. A night that should have been filled with joy but instead turned into an unspeakable tragedy. This is the story of the murder of Peter Fabiano, an innocent man killed right on his doorstep by a masked figure. Join me as we uncover the chilling truth behind the Halloween night curse and how a twisted love affair turned into a horrifying crime. This story will definitely make you see Halloween in a whole new light. Chapter 1. The Sweet Lie. Halloween night, a seemingly harmless evening when children in masks and candy bags roamed the streets. Laughter echoed, pumpkin lanterns flickered, and a festive atmosphere spread throughout California. But in a small house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, something dark was lurking, a secret carefully hidden behind innocent smiles. Peter Fabiano stood in the living room, his eyes gazing distantly through the window. His peaceful home was now filled with an unfamiliar feeling. The sounds outside, the footsteps, the children's laughter, were muffled by the stifling silence inside. His wife, Betty, felt it too. Ever since Joan Rabel, the woman who had once been her lover, reappeared in their lives, something unexplainable had begun to invade their existence. "Did you hear that?" Betty whispered, her voice trembling. Peter nodded but said nothing. He had the eerie sense that invisible eyes were watching from outside. Dark shadows lingering around the house. The Halloween festivities outside, with children joyfully trick-or-treating, seemed unable to cross the boundary of the Fabiano home. All Peter could feel was a creeping coldness, like darkness had taken root long ago, waiting for the right moment to rise. The doorbell suddenly rang. Peter flinched, a chill running down his spine. Who could be here at this hour? He walked cautiously toward the door, carefully opening it, but what greeted him was not the sight of excited children he had expected. Instead, standing before him was a strange child. Eyes gleamed from behind a grotesque mask, glowing eerily in the dim yellow light of the house. The mask covered the entire face, hiding everything, but it couldn't conceal the dark, empty eyes underneath. The figure's height was too tall for a child, and its movements, they weren't innocent at all. "Trick or treat," a hoarse voice rasped, strangled by something wicked, something unnerving. Peter forced a smile, unable to shake the odd feeling engulfing the house. He reached for a few candies from the bowl by the door. But as he did, he paused. His eyes met the hollow stare of the figure before him. There was nothing normal about that look. No joy or excitement of a child seeking candy. It was the gaze of someone hiding something, a terrifying deceit. He tried to smile again, offering the candy, but in that moment, a sharp sensation pierced Peter's chest. His eyes widened, the smile faded from his lips. He didn't know why, but his heart was warning him of something unspeakably dreadful. As the candy touched the figure's hand, the dark presence suddenly retreated, vanishing like a ghost into the night. The door slammed shut, but it wasn't Peter who closed it. Some invisible force had pressed it shut. Peter stood there, his heart pounding, but he couldn't explain why. His instincts were right. This Halloween night was far from innocent, and the figure at the door was not a harmless child. Peter didn't know that the person who had just appeared before him wasn't anyone else but Joan Rabel, carrying with her hatred and twisted love, hidden behind a mask. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. Joan Rabel walked through the darkness, her mask blending seamlessly with the cold, still Halloween night. Her footsteps were eerily quiet, as if they didn't touch the ground, each step seeming to avoid the light. In her hand, a small gun lay hidden beneath her coat, a part of the meticulous plan she had crafted long ago. Everything had been arranged, every detail had been carefully calculated, every step, every moment. For months, Joan had been preparing for this. Her obsessive love for Betty Fabiano, Peter's wife, had twisted into hatred and obsession. Peter, the man standing in her way, was the reason Joan had lost everything. He had taken Betty from her, and now Joan had nothing left, only the burning desire for revenge. Old memories flashed through Joan's mind, like blurry, haunting images from a film. She remembered the last time she saw Betty, when everything fell apart. Betty had chosen Peter, and Joan had become a ghost in her life. That betrayal had ripped Joan's soul apart, turning her love into uncontrollable hatred. In the darkness of her own mind, Joan began to devise a plan to destroy Peter, not just to kill him. but to poison the very home he and Betty had built. She had reached out to an accomplice, someone equally dissatisfied with life. And together they crafted the perfect plan. Halloween, a night of masks and hidden secrets, was the ideal time. Joan knew that Peter wouldn't suspect anything when he opened the door for a child in a Halloween costume. On this night, everyone wore masks, and no one could see the truth behind them. Joan paused under the dim light of the Fabiano house. The darkness enveloping her, the cold gun in her hand reminded her of the task ahead. She looked up at Peter's front door, her eyes behind the mask filled with a haunting resolve. No longer hesitant or fearful. Tonight, it would all end. Peter would no longer stand in her way. And Betty would forever remember Joan, not with love, but as a never-ending nightmare. She stepped toward the door, the wind howling around her like demonic whispers conspiring with her. As she pressed the doorbell, the sound cut through the silence, sharp and eerie. She could hear Peter's footsteps inside, slowly approaching the door. When the door opened, Joan stared straight into Peter's eyes through the mask. He didn't recognize her, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his gaze, as if he sensed something was off. In that moment, Joan saw his vulnerability, the man who seemed so strong, now easily undone by deceit and hatred. It filled Joan with a cold satisfaction. In a flash, she pulled out the gun, and in an instant, it was aimed directly at Peter. Before he could react, a gunshot rang out, shattering the quiet night. The bullet cut through the air, hitting Peter square in the chest. Time seemed to stop for that moment. The porch light flickered, and the darkness absorbed the terror. Peter staggered, his eyes wide with shock, his mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. He collapsed to the cold ground, blood seeping from the wound, merging with the shadows of Halloween night. Joan stood there, silently looking down at Peter's lifeless body. No more forced smiles, no more suspicious glances. It was over, or at least, that's what she thought. Joan took a deep breath, her eyes empty behind the mask. She had done what she thought she needed to do. But why didn't her heart feel satisfied? On the ground, Peter's blood soaked into the darkness, spreading like poison. Joan turned and walked away, leaving his body lying at the doorstep. Her footsteps faded into the night, swallowed by the eerie silence. Chapter 3. The Silent Bullet. The night continued, blanketing every corner of the town in a pale mist. The air was heavy and still, like the calm before a storm. Joan Rabel, having completed her deadly plan, quietly left the scene. She walked like a ghost, as the dry leaves rustled under the cold wind, sounding like whispers from the underworld. Peter Fabiano's house was now steeped in an eerie silence. The door was slightly ajar, like a dark, gaping mouth waiting for something even more horrific to happen. Peter's lifeless body lay motionless on the doorstep, his eyes wide open, staring up at the night sky, devoid of life. Blood trickled from his wound, flowing slowly, but no one had discovered it yet. Only the darkness bore witness to this tragic death and betrayal. Joan returned home, her mind filled with mixed emotions. She had achieved her goal, but instead of satisfaction, something strange gnawed at her. A cold feeling spread through her chest, not from the night's chill, but from a vague fear she had never known before. She sat in her small room, her eyes staring into the darkness through the window. The wind howled outside, carrying with it sounds like eerie, ghostly laughter that echoed in her mind. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, but in the darkness, the sound of the gunshot that killed Peter still rang out, refusing to be silenced. And then, like a distant ghost, the sound of footsteps began to echo. Footsteps. At first, they were faint, as if carried away by the wind, but gradually, they grew clearer, more deliberate. Joan opened her eyes, her heart pounding. The sound of footsteps echoed through the silent room, as if someone was pacing just outside her door. She stared at the closed door, a knot of fear tightening in her chest. "It can't be," Joan whispered to herself. She stood up and walked toward the door, her senses sharpened, every little sound in the house now ringing loudly in her head. But when she opened the door, there was nothing. No one was there, just the thick night and the cold wind. She returned to her room, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that clung to her mind. But every time she closed her eyes, the image of Peter Fabiano came back, his wide, lifeless eyes staring at her from the darkness. A deep sense of guilt began to consume Joan, like invisible hands tightening around her throat. That night, Joan dreamed of Peter. He didn't say anything, just stood there, right in front of her house. His eyes filled with silent resentment. In the dream, the bullet she had fired hovered in midair, as if it had never struck its target. But in reality, she knew the bullet had hit its mark, sending Peter into the world of the dead. The next morning, news of Peter Fabiano's death spread quickly through the town. His small house was cordoned off. Police swarmed the area, and whispers began to spread among the townspeople. A murder on Halloween night, the worst nightmare they could imagine. The children who had once received candy from the Fabiano household now didn't dare to go near it. A grim atmosphere blanketed every corner. Betty, Peter's wife, was in shock. She couldn't believe her husband was dead. And even more so, she couldn't believe that Joan, the woman she had once loved, could have committed such a brutal act. Joan was put under suspicion by the police, but there was not enough clear evidence to charge her. However, inside her, the fear was growing, becoming something far worse than the pursuit of the law. Joan began to feel Peter's presence everywhere she went. His ghost, though not visible, seemed to linger in the dark corners of her mind. She heard his footsteps when she was alone, the whispers in the night keeping her from sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his wide-open eyes, staring deep into her soul like an unspoken accusation. Joan's mind was slowly being consumed by darkness. She couldn't escape the feeling that Peter was still there, watching her from another world, a place where traitors never found peace. The Halloween night had not just ended with Peter Fabiano's death, it had opened a door to hell, where the betrayed soul sought to return to the world of the living. As Joan lay in bed, trying to close her eyes, she could feel Peter's presence growing closer and closer. Then, in the cold of the night, she heard the faint sound of her window creaking open. A gust of icy wind blew into the room, carrying with it the smell of blood and darkness. Joan's hands trembled as she clutched the blanket, but when she looked up, she saw Peter's figure standing right in front of her, silent. His gaze was full of judgment, a gaze Joan knew she could never escape. His ghost had returned, not just to haunt her, but to seek justice for his wrongful death. The silent bullet she had fired that night had come back, and Joan knew that the price of betrayal could never be avoided. Chapter 4. The mask shattered. Night had wrapped Joan in a thick mist, but this was not the familiar darkness she once knew. This was something else, heavy, oppressive, filled with whispers from unknown sources. Since the night she killed Peter Fabiano, Joan hadn't had a peaceful sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Peter's wide-open, unblinking eyes staring at her, full of judgment she could never escape. In her small room, Joan felt as if the walls were closing in on her. Everything in the house seemed to come alive, the creaking windows, the groaning of old wooden floors, and most disturbingly, the footsteps. Every night, the footsteps echoed, drawing closer, even though the doors were locked, and Joan was alone in the house. But darkness didn't need an open door to enter. It didn't need an invitation. It was always there, patiently waiting. Joan began to realize that Peter's death was not just the end of a life. She had opened an invisible door, and her guilt and betrayal had summoned something far more terrifying. One night, Joan decided to wait. She sat before the mirror, the Halloween mask from that night still lying there, silent as an invisible accomplice. The mask she had worn to hide her true identity had now become a symbol of the lies that had taken root in her life. The hollow eyes of the mask seemed to stare back at Joan, as if trying to tell her something she didn't dare to face. Time seemed to stop. The room grew colder. The dim lights flickered as if blown by an unseen wind. Then, once again, the footsteps returned, slow, deliberate, but unmistakable. Joan held her breath, her body stiff, listening intently. This time, the footsteps were no longer distant. They were so close she could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath her feet. She turned her head toward the door, terror filling her heart. The door had opened slightly, and the thick darkness outside seemed to spill into the room like a silent predator. Suddenly, a chill ran down Joan's spine. She knew that Peter was there. There was no doubt anymore. He had returned. Peter, Joan whispered, her voice hoarse, unsure if it was a plea or a confession. The darkness answered with a terrifying silence. Joan stood up, her legs trembling as she walked toward the door. She couldn't hide any longer. Peter's ghost had come too close. Too strong to ignore. She had to face it. The room outside the door was pitch black. Joan stepped into it, her shaky hands gripping the wall for balance. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, the air grew heavier. She felt an invisible force pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, from within the darkness, a voice spoke. It wasn't the wind, nor the footsteps. It was Peter's voice, soft, but filled with power, echoing from the shadows. "Joan, you can't run anymore." Joan froze, her heart racing. This was not her imagination. Peter was here, in this room, with her. She tried to look around, but the darkness was too thick. She could see nothing but faint, blurry shapes. She turned to flee, but her legs felt glued to the floor. The entire room was like a trap, sealing off every escape. She screamed in panic, but her scream was swallowed by the darkness. No one could hear her. Only Peter. "You killed me. Your mask is gone." Joan frantically looked around, her eyes desperate for a way out. But all she saw was the darkness. And in that darkness, Peter's figure began to materialize. Ghostly but unmistakable, his eyes bore into her, stripping away every lie and every sin she had hidden for so long. Her invisible mask, the one she had worn her entire life, was now shattered. All that remained was the naked truth of her crime. And Joan knew there was no escape. Peter's ghost had returned not just to haunt her, but to reclaim his life. "Please, forgive me," Joan whispered, but her voice disappeared into the air. Peter said nothing more, but his gaze said it all. Joan felt an invisible force tightening around her throat, as if Peter's hand had reached out from the darkness to take her life. She struggled, but it was futile. In her final moments, Joan felt the world spin around her. No more light, no more breath. The darkness had swallowed her completely. And in her mind, only one phrase echoed. "The mask has shattered. Joan, there's nothing left to hide." Chapter 5. The Eternal Ghost. Joan Rabel disappeared from life as quietly as she had entered it. Her house no longer had lights, no longer had sounds of life. All that remained was a thick, cold darkness, an eerie silence that chilled the air. No one ever found Joan, and those who once knew her gradually forgot the name that had been tied to tragedy. But death doesn't easily let go. Months later, Peter Fabiano's house still carried the weight of an unsettling presence. His wife, Betty, moved out shortly after her husband's death. She couldn't bear the painful memories, the dark corners of the house, where the echoes of the gunshot and the image of Peter collapsing at the doorstep seemed to linger. Neighbors claimed that whenever they passed the house late at night, they often heard faint footsteps from within, as if someone was still wandering, unwilling to leave. Perhaps it was Peter, but Joan, the one who killed him, was far from finding peace. Her crime wasn't just in taking the life of an innocent man, but also in betraying herself, turning love into obsession and hatred. And that betrayal had opened a new path, one where she would forever be trapped in the darkness she had created. One night, a storm descended on the town. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the abandoned Fabiano house. A group of curious teenagers, intrigued by the ghostly stories about Peter and Joan, decided to break into the house. The rumors of Peter and Joan's ghosts had spread, becoming a nightmare for those seeking to test their bravery. They entered the house, flashlights trembling as they illuminated the time-worn walls. Each of their footsteps echoed, the sound reverberating as if the house itself was breathing, watching. Everything felt empty, but none of them felt safe. As the group approached the front door, where Peter had been shot, one of them instinctively paused. The bravest of them felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Does anyone hear that?" he asked quietly. The others exchanged glances, confused, until they heard it too, the soft sound of footsteps, belonging to no one in the group. The footsteps came from above, where Joan had spent her final days. The footsteps of regret, of a soul never at rest. The darkness in the house seemed to hold an eerie pull. The lightning outside barely pierced the shadows within, making everything seem more alive. Suddenly, a door upstairs creaked open with a spine-chilling groan. The group froze, no one daring to move. From the darkness of the upstairs room, a figure slowly emerged. Joan. Her eyes were empty, her face pale. But the most terrifying part was the mask she had worn that fateful Halloween night. It was still there, half hidden, like a symbol of her unerasable guilt. "We should leave," one of them whispered. But their feet seemed glued to the floor. Unable to move, they could only stand there, watching Joan approach them, as light and insubstantial as a cold breeze. Her ghost was no longer just a memory, it was real. A manifestation of eternal suffering and guilt. Joan came closer, her hollow eyes staring through them, as if she saw nothing. She wasn't searching for the strangers, she was searching for Peter, the man she had betrayed. The house fell into an eerie silence, as if even the wind outside had ceased. Joan stood there, her hands reaching out as though trying to grasp something long lost. But no one answered her call. Peter was gone, but she remained trapped, forever in the cycle of her own making. Her ghost, and the mask of her lies, would remain, never fading. Then, in that moment of terror, a piercing screech cut through the air. The front door burst open, and darkness flooded into the house, accompanied by the chilling screams of those who had witnessed the nightmare. Joan vanished into the void, along with the horrific sounds that echoed throughout the abandoned house. The next day, locals discovered the front door of the Fabiano house wide open, but there was no sign of anyone inside. The group of teenagers never returned, and from that moment on, no one dared approach the house again. They said that, when night falls, anyone brave enough to stand at the doorstep could hear Joan's footsteps still wandering, searching for the release she would never find. But what was more terrifying than anything else was the whisper that echoed from the deepest corners of the darkness. "My mask never fades." The case of Peter Fabiano is not just a simple tragedy, it's proof that sometimes masks don't just hide faces, but also conceal the deepest of sins. Halloween is meant to be a night of mystery, but this story takes everything to a whole new level, a true story of hatred, betrayal, and death. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more spine-chilling stories. Make sure to turn on the notification bell to receive the latest videos from the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next chilling tale.